everyone. It's so nice to see all of you in your boxes. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable. Definitely, I'd love to see your faces. But I'm very excited to share this talk with you all today. This talk will be primarily speaking to those who may be designing mobile apps for the first time, or it may be a design space you're not too familiar with. So we'll be using this time to really help provide a design guide that can help you when it comes time for you to embark on your next mobile project. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see, the age-old question of, can you see my screen? Is this in view for folks? Awesome. Okay. So just to give a little quick blurb about myself, as Ben mentioned, I'm a senior product designer at Carbon 5. I'm based out of the New York office, currently living in Brooklyn. And I am originally from San Francisco, from the Bay Area. And I miss it dearly. This is one of my favorite locations, the Ferry Building. And I have a great affinity for Star Wars and robots in general. I have like some robot art, which is very, very silly. But I really have come to pick up a new hobby and have just been getting into building Legos. And that's been something that's helped me during this quarantine remote time and help calm some nerves. And I tend to drink way too many iced coffees a day. So just a little blurb about myself. I've been working as a product designer for almost 7 years now. And I've worked on various web apps, various mobile apps. And this is just a snapshot of some of the mobile apps that I've worked on in the past. And looking back, designing and working on my first app or my first apps in general was very intimidating. And for me, there were lessons that were learned along the way, some lessons learned the hard way. And I was only really able to get a better grasp after designing and working on a few apps and working with a few different teams. So most people who are in that position of designing an app for the first time, you may go and try to educate yourself before you start. But what I've seen is that in trying to go out and learn a little bit more, education around mobile app design can be somewhat limited. There are blog posts out there. They usually cover high-level concepts, but don't really get into practical methods you can incorporate in your day-to-day work. Tangential to that, if you are researching and learning about platforms that you're designing for, some of the platform documentation isn't always clear for designers or from a design perspective. It goes into great depth for development documentation, but as a designer, it's not commonly known what you truly have available to work with when you're designing. So what I hope that you'll walk away with today is one, that mobile design will feel less scary and feel less intimidating, and that you can walk away with a plan and a strategic approach for your next project. So if I were to go into a time machine and go back in time and give myself advice, there were some recurring things I could have avoided. One thing that I would tend to do is I would over-design solutions and visuals. And what I mean by over-design is always really like designing custom components when there wasn't enough time for the team to build them. Another thing is I wasn't fully aware of all of the platform components and what they were called. There are two platforms, iOS and Android, and certain things are named differently. And so I didn't have a full awareness around that. When I would do design reviews or present flows, I didn't always have a perspective on how screens would enter and exit. So if there was a core flow and a nested flow within it, there was always the question of, well, how would these screens come into view and dismiss? And finally, I wasn't fully aware of the standard patterns of current apps just in general. So because of that, I would use sometimes incorrect component heights. I'd use type or icons that were either too large or too small in comparison to standard patterns. So one way to avoid these things is to kind of think with the analogy that you as a designer have a superhero belt to help you fight crime, and you are equipped with key items before you even start. And it's really a matter of having an awareness of what you have, having awareness and basically building out that belt as time goes on. For me, in the beginning, I would just jump straight into solutioning without really taking a pause to see what I had to work with. And what most folks may not know is that you have a lot that you can use that already exists that the platform gives you. And it's really a matter of you pausing for a moment to determine, does the platform provide this already? Does this work? Or this kind of works, but I need a bespoke version of this to solve this problem. Or saying, oh, all of these are great, but for this app, for this particular problem, we're gonna need something new. And it's really important to be able just to take that moment to pause and empower yourself to help make a more informed decision. So this little guy is going to pop up from time to time throughout the presentation, just as a little Easter egg to signal those key moments and when you can start to build out your belt. So let's go ahead and jump into what the differences are between designing for mobile apps and designing for web. So web is primarily responsive. There is some fluidity there. There's the ability to reflow and rearrange a layout. CSS media queries help you do that. Flexbox really gives you a lot of power to do that. But for mobile apps specifically, it's a lot more adaptive. And there is the ability to adjust certain elements, but that adjustment is based on constraints. So constraints are essentially set points that you can pin to a particular area that'll determine a width of an item or a height of an item. So for here, you could see if we were to talk about the constraints of this particular layout on the phone, you have a constraint on the left and the right. So because that is set, no matter what width of phone that you have, this banner element will adjust in width because those constraints are determining that. So it's a little bit different in that sense. Also, with mobile apps, there isn't an ability to easily reflow or easily rearrange unless it's specifically coded to do so for a particular device. So some key differences there. So there are two platforms that exist. We have iOS and Android. iOS is coded in Swift in the Xcode application. Android is coded in Java and Kotlin in the Android Studio application. And each of these platforms provide a kit of components that you essentially get for free or out of the box. So a developer can take a component and basically plug and play without any additional work. There are two other players I do want to call out. We won't get into detail with these, but they are important to just note in the sense where there are frameworks, two popular ones being React Native and Flutter. And these frameworks help you deploy to both Android and iOS apps simultaneously, meaning that you can design and develop a single experience that plugs into both platforms, and it's kind of a one-size-fits-all situation. So it's common, this is common for startups, maybe smaller teams. If you need to get something out the door quickly, there is a tendency to build on and design on these platforms. So React Native comes with its own kit of components and its own set of rules. And Flutter, I haven't dived too much deep into that, but I imagine there are some key differences there. So something to note, again, we won't get into too much detail, but if you hear that, that is a definition of what those things are. So if we were to take a moment to look at iOS and what are the platform components and what is that for the iOS platform? iOS platform kit of components, the most recent is iOS 14. So that recently got an update last year in 2020. The biggest updates was that they updated the calendar and the time picker. Got significant updates. They introduced a color picker as well, app clips where you can scan a QR code and basically get a smaller version of an app without actually fully downloading an app. So key things there that got updated this year. There's a really great resource on Figma community. If you go to @Joey, there is a Figma file that basically has a display of all of the different components iOS provides that you can plug into your designs. So those are great, but what tends to happen is they are static designs, and it's kind of hard to know how things interact. Mobile apps are so interactive. You're scrolling, you're swiping, there are gestures, and it's really helpful to actually see those components come to life and how a user would actually go about using that. So this is a really great resource. I highly recommend you download this app. It's called Developer. And this app is built completely from iOS components. And these components are basically out of the box, where you can see the different button styles, the different icons you get. So you get a set of glyphs with the iPhone platform or the iOS platform that you can use, how search functions, and basically being able to play around with that. In addition to that, the developer app is a collection of the WWDC videos. So you can look and basically watch those videos as another way to educate yourself on the different components. Tangential to that, for Android, the platform components are material design. So there is a Figma file out there at material design, where you can see a layout of all of the components that they provide, and a way for you to interact with those components and see them in action. If you don't have an Android device, a good gauge is to download any Google-based apps, so YouTube, Google Calendar, Google Mail. Those tend to use components such as chips. They have the bottom sheets, the side drawer navigation, as a way for you to play around with that and get a little more familiar. So let's go into what it means to start your project and how to begin with a strategic game plan. This is something that I started to do that was really helpful and really set the tone and really helped prepare me and be a little bit better equipped. The first thing that's really helpful is, before your project starts, take a little time and pre-game with your tech lead. So what do I mean by pregame? Really just taking some time to meet with them and just ask them questions that you have in particular about the stack, about the platform, what you as a designer should potentially watch out for, things that you as a designer should keep in mind or avoid. A good question I tend to ask is, if you were to give a designer from your last project some advice, what would that be? And so that can help just kind of give you a sense of certain factors to consider. So there are different factors for different projects. A big one is time constraints. Is it a short project? Is it a longer project? Stack familiarity. Is it your first time? Is it my first time designing on this platform? Is the team pretty familiar, or is it something that we're all going to be learning together? The second thing that's very important is to become familiar with the platform that the project is going to be worked on and its nomenclature. Speaking the same language as your development team will help avoid confusion and speed up communication loops, especially in this remote time, in this remote world that we're living in. It's really, really helpful to speak that same language. So as you're getting familiar with the platform and its components, what things are called, those factors that you can consider for that particular project is to stop and think, what components can I leverage for this particular project? Might there be anything the platform components don't provide that this might need? And just kind of taking note of those things. And then finally, being able to take some time and uncover the target device sizes. Now, why this is important, basically designing on the device size that is most common amongst the target audience will most likely optimize the experience for the largest group of users that are going to be interacting with it. So those questions are definitely to ask, who is the target audience? What platform, what devices are being used by that target audience? There was one project where we were targeting teens who are going to be downloading the app, who would be living outside of the US in different countries. They would most likely have older phone models. So we decided to design on the smallest Android screen to get a sense of how most people would experience the app. So helpful thing to do. And so when we're looking at target device sizes and what that means, this is basically a breakdown of the device artboard sizes you can use. And I'm very specific on the word artboard. So these are not the pixel resolutions, but instead the points that you would put in your Figma or in your sketch file. So last year, Apple released 4 new iPhone 12 models. And so in releasing those new models, the largest iPhone is no longer the 414 in width, it is now the 428. And now there's a middle ground between the X and the S Plus at 390 width. And then the iPhone 12 mini is essentially the same dimensions as the X at 375 by 812. So this is just a nice little breakdown so you can see what device sizes you might design for Apple. Android, this basically is just kind of showing similar counterparts in width and height. These are by no means all of the Android devices. There are many, many, many. So these are called out just to kind of show the popular Android devices that are in similar width and height. So if you're designing a project for both iOS and Android, you can pick similar models so the designs aren't too different. So in looking at this, there is one model that is a significant outlier in width and height in comparison to everyone else. And it's good to ask maybe your product owner or stakeholders if the SE just needs to look decent and function, or if it is in fact a common phone amongst the target audience. It's an important question to ask, and here's why. A smaller phone, basically because there is set points in width and height, you basically get a constrained view, and it's almost like a window view that can potentially cut off or not show elements that you would see on a larger phone. So this example is that because we have set points, we have a card width at 284, and because it's set and smaller phones are basically a window view, this is good to afford scrolling on the iPhone X, but when you look at it on the SE, it cuts the card off and it's not clear that you can scroll. So one thing you can do is kind of think responsively and say, instead of setting a width as a set point, you can call out percentages and set width as a percentage of the screen. That way, when you go and view it on an SE, it can basically constrain based on the percentage of the device, and you're able to optimize across many devices. And it's not just for widths, but it can also be provided for heights. So let's say this confirmation screen, you have a top height of 204 points. So on the SE, it's going to push content down and potentially cut items off. So if you use a percentage, you can get it a little bit more, contextual to the device size. So now you can see the content in view. So this is a good formula I tend to use. So basically taking the point value of either the width or height, dividing it by the device width or height that you're designing for, multiply by 100, and that'll give you that percentage to kind of guesstimate what can work. There is power in pairing. So pairing with developers is extremely helpful. And basically it's some time for you to just take 5 minutes or so and ask if we can look at the designs from a few different device sizes. So typically if you're designing, it'll go from your device design size going up typically will work just fine. It's when it goes smaller, it can be a little bit more unpredictable. So taking some time to look at it at a large phone and a small phone, just to see if elements are potentially getting cut off. There was one time in a project where we had a reserve button and it was totally in view on the iPhone X, but on the SE, it was cutting the button off. And so we needed to make that container scrollable. So now it's functional on both. So this is a great thing to do from time to time, just to sit and pair with the developer and just kind of see things from multiple devices. So let's talk about now during your project. The project is in motion. It's important to leverage what you get for free, that being the platform components, as much as possible. It doesn't always have to be the case, but you can try to do it as much as possible. And why it's helpful is that this can really help save development time on supporting items and really give focus on designing and building those core features or those hero moments of the app, whatever those may be. So these are just some top components you can leverage for your project. These are the things that tend to come up a lot of the time. These are not all of them, but bringing highlight to the key ones that you'll most likely use often. So we have navigation bars for iOS. There are two versions. There's the standard and the large. The large, when you scroll, basically animates the text to morph into the standard version. Tab bars for navigation. There's also the toolbar, which is different from a tab bar. The toolbar is a place where you can take action on a screen that is not related to navigation. You do get a search bar, which is pretty awesome. And there are various button types. So there are rounded rectangle button types that you can have icons within them. There are also small buttons. So you may have seen this in the Apple Store. So you get access to that as well. And there are other types of small buttons that are circular called small action controls that you can use in the header area. Additionally, the biggest update in iOS 14 from a component standpoint is the date and time picker, which I feel is pretty awesome. Definitely has had a significant improvement. There is the selection picker. As I mentioned before, there's a set of icons called glyphs that you can use out of the box. So you don't necessarily have to provide an asset. You can basically reference a name and you get that. There are other items, sheets, a share activity sheet, a pull down menus. Those are completely new in iOS 14, where you can trigger from text or from an icon, a list of items, and those can be separated by dividers. You could have accordions with them. You can have icons incorporated. So pretty good list of things. In addition to that, on the Android side, Android tends to have a more robust set of components, but this is just a quick snapshot. So as you can see, the navigation bar in iOS is not called a navigation bar here. It's a top app bar. So if I were to go back in iOS, these are navigation bars. In Android, these are top app bars. And the tab bar that we would refer to in iOS is actually called bottom navigation in Android. So some things to note there in differences in naming. But there is the standard and extended version. There are tabs that you can use that could either be fixed or scrollable. Selection chips, which are really great. There are cards, snack bars for confirming action. That's probably my favorite one to use. Bottom sheets as a counterpart to the action sheets. And then finally, a navigation drawer, which usually is open from a hamburger menu or a profile icon. So you may ask, well, all those are great, but they kind of look very iOS-y or very Android-y, and the app I'm working on is visually branded, or it needs to be visually branded. It needs to look a little bit different. So there are things that you can alter with the free components. So for example, if you were to look at before and after, the things that you can alter is the typeface. So the typeface you can change within the system's theming. You can also change the text size or the type scale that come with it. And so that you can also change within the theming. You can change the text color. So going from white to black as an example in Android, as well as background or element colors. So you can kind of see from this perspective in the after, this just tends to look a little bit more visually branded, but still using the free components you get. So there may be a question that has come up of how do you know if you're using components correctly? So one thing you can do is there are 3 resources that are incredibly helpful that help give definition. One of them being the Human Interface Guidelines, or the HIG guidelines. So that's a little link here. But with the Human Interface Guidelines, it's very high level, and they don't get too much in depth on the variants or do's and don'ts. So a nice tangential resource to use is that WWDC 2020 website. Also, that developer app that I showed in the beginning, these are basically videos of developers showcasing components, talking about all the variants, all the variations, and to hear it from a developer perspective and knowing what you can alter is incredibly helpful. So I'll tend to use both of them if the interface guidelines isn't quite answering my questions. And then for Android, we have material design. This documentation is extremely thorough. They give the specs, they show do's and don'ts, they show video of how things interact. They're very clear on the definition. So I rarely have questions around material components. I have to do a little bit more digging on the iOS side, but these are really three really helpful resources for you to kind of gauge if you want to use a component or if you're using a component correctly, what that might be. I'm going to skip this for sake of time and go into navigation and transitions. So for navigation, there are three key things to note. The first one being the tab bar. So tab bars persist throughout most of the app. It makes it easy for users to navigate around the app no matter where they are. And typically it's around 3 to 5 items that can hold the functionality of the app. I have seen instances where there are 2 items. I believe Google Mail as well as the iCloud app just have 2 items. But typically it's 3 to 5. And there are different variants or different flavors you could do. The most common being that you have an icon paired with the title. Apps such as Instagram or some other ones that try to be a little bit more minimal go with just an icon only. So that's certainly a question of, is the icon very clear for a user where it doesn't need the title paired with it? I've also seen instances where it's mostly a title with some type of embellishment underneath. So that first one being the tab bar. The second in navigation is knowing the navigation bars and what those do. So navigation bars help users see where they are. It's anchored at the top. So it provides a way for you to, one, know what screen you're on, and so that title provides that context. It also allows the user to either go back to the previous screen or close out of a view, as well as take secondary action. So you may see 1 or 2 icons here, or the ellipse icon where you can either favorite or open up another menu. So this is helpful that you have that little area on the side for secondary actions for navigation bars. So there are different flavors than just those that come with the platform. So for iOS, we talked about the standard, but in that standard, you could potentially not have a back or a cancel. So say it's like a landing screen for home. You could just have a title. You could also have the title paired with a back and a cancel. One thing to note is that it doesn't always have to have a title. So it's really dependent on the context and what you're solving for. So you could have a header that does not have a title paired with it. And one thing to call out for iOS specifically is that you could have a standard header with small action controls as well as glyphs. So there are 2 flavors there. So any actions that you want to have in that top right corner, they can be shown in either form. For the Android side, this is just an example without the title. There's a little bit more room for those secondary actions. There is an extended view, and that counterpart in iOS is that large title. And then finally, there is something called a modal stack. So we'll get into transitions in a second, but essentially a modal is a screen coming up and sliding in from the bottom. So that for iOS, you could have within that modal stack a standard or large title. And then in Android, there is a counterpart to that where it is called a contextual action bar. So that you'll get with the X, and in that you can do different things. You could create an account, you can add an email. So just a couple of different flavors that you can use for your project. So looking into screen transitions, we talked about the tab bar, the navigation bar. When we talk about how screens enter and exit, there are 3 very particular, very common ones that are used that are helpful to know. So the first one being the push transition. So when you tap on something, typically it's a list view with the caret. So if you tap on that, it'll push in and sliding in from the right. So the push transition is typically used for any screen that progresses sequentially. So those types of screens will likely get a push transition. For any new flow or action, so let's say a button or a card or a confirmation screen, those would likely get a modal transition, which is the screen sliding in from the bottom. And then the third transition, the shared element transition, is when an element is carried from a previous screen to the next screen. So you may have seen this in maybe the App Store, where you hit on a card and that image expands and you see a more detailed view. So that transition is usually for any screen providing a detailed view, any screen providing more context. That's just like a little more of a fancier transition that you have to work with. So with that, that is kind of just in a nutshell, a handful of items that you can use for your project. One thing that's always been really helpful to help build up your skill is one, to not only design, but to prototype and mirror on your phone. And mirroring on your phone is probably the thing that will really help refine your chops. Specifically just to see the visual design, being able to interact with flows. So say you have a flow and a nested flow within it. So you have a screen coming up from the bottom. You decide to edit an email, so that screen is going to slide in from the right, but you need to add an additional email. Well, how does that third screen transition? So being able to prototype and actually see it and play with it on your phone really helps determine which screen transitions are best, so a user doesn't lose sight of where they are. So getting a little phone stand is super helpful. This is pretty much my setup at home. So whenever I'm designing a visual design, I'll always have that phone on the side to be able to look at it, to be able to play with it, and just kind of see it from a user's perspective. So super, super helpful, and highly encourage you incorporate that into your process. And tangential to that, it's really great just to stay inspired. There's a lot of inspiration out there. Download apps, screenshots, screen record as much as you can. I have like a full photo roll and reel of many different apps. And so it's really good just to kind of get a sense of what's out there, what are the standard patterns, what are new patterns that are emerging. There tends to be apps that end up breaking the rules, and those new patterns end up becoming the standard after a few years. So being able to just kind of keep an eye out for those things and have them either in your photo reel or off in a drive somewhere to be able to go back and reference and inspire you for when you're solving problems. And lastly, practice if you can. There is an example app that I created called the Coffee Pickup app, which essentially was really small, and it was meant to do a few things. It was for a blog post, and it was meant to call out the 3 core things to think about when you're building an app. And that is the navigation, what a core flow might be and how screens transitions within those core flows, and what scroll behaviors might happen. So I'll move over here. You can see a video. It may be choppy over Zoom, I apologize. But just a way for me to practice the visual design, the type hierarchy, how screens enter and transition, what happens with the push, and being comfortable just putting together an entire experience and thinking about it holistically. So with that, I leave you with a design challenge where you can take what you've learned and heard here today and essentially practice by designing and prototyping a simple app, where you can think about how the navigation would function, what would show in a tab bar, how many items would that be, what a core flow would be, no less than 3 screens, how those screens would transition, and also extra credit if you want, thinking about scroll behaviors. Is there a horizontal stack of items where you can scroll or unscroll? Is there any transitions in the header and things like that? There's a great prompt simulator out there called Briefs. So if you need inspiration, here's an example where you can design an app that finds nearby dog parks. So totally welcome to use that, and encourage you to try this out when you have some free time, if you have free time. And in doing this exercise, you can continue to build out your superhero belt for future projects. So with that, thank you all for listening. That was my talk. There was a lot of content in there. I'm like kind of winded. There was a lot to speak about. I hope it was helpful.